Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is episode 3, Making the Decisions That Enhance Your Retirement Years. By our retirement years, we can do a lot of things on autopilot. We've been there, done that. While that attitude is pretty normal after 60 or 70 or 75 or 80 years on this planet, it might not serve us well. I'm hoping that one of the decisions you'll make before this podcast is over is maybe to consider whether it might be important to take a fresh look at or a fresh try at being a little more conscious as we go through our day of where there might be a decision I need to make here, even though to the observer it might not seem that there's any decision to be made. If you continue listening to this podcast, which I hope you will, you'll have an opportunity at various points to check and see whether there is a decision here that it might be helpful for me to make. If we want to have a good, whatever that is for you, retirement, then it serves us well to live our retirement years consciously, with consciousness. On the one hand, this can sound like work, and it is to a degree. On the other hand, it gives us lots of options. Sometimes to not make a decision is to have made one. In time, I think the issue becomes not only a matter of an individual decision here or there, but of a pattern of how we make decisions or see a need for decisions, or how aware we are of the result of a decision's having been made or not made. Ultimately, how we think about retirement is going to have a lot to say about how our retirement turns out. Our decisions can be life-enhancing or can be life-deadening. Okay, I don't want to belabor this point for too long, so let me make a short announcement and then we'll get into the subject matter for today's podcast. If you're listening for the first time, there are a couple of podcasts that have come before this, and my plan was to use the first few podcasts and the first few blog posts to set a general framework for the work to come and for the work of finding for you answers to your questions and the information that would be helpful to you. So I suggest that you backtrack and pick up on any of the first two podcasts that you might have missed, because taken together, they give a background and a frame for what's to come and the work to be done. So here's the work that's going to be done today, at least the topics for the moment. I'm going to talk about my basic approach, like what underlies pretty much everything I do with my site and why. And then some classic retirement issues, one I call the tyranny of chronological age, keeping on, allowing yourself to dream, midlife crisis, the cure for exhaustion, and resilience. And having heard that list, you and I both know there's a chance we won't get to all those today, but I will pick them up as we go along. My basic approach is based largely on my 30 years as a psychotherapist and what I learned in that process. And so when people talk about their various issues, all of which are important to them, whether it's anxiety or what they're going to do with their time in retirement, or depression, loneliness, the various topics that you might have experienced and hear other people talk about, my basic approach is that the solution to most of our personal problems, if not all of them, is our own personal growth. It's not something so much outside of ourselves, but from within. And that's rather classic because an important part of the second half of life, or our retirement years, is to go inward. If we haven't been used to that during the rest of our life, it's a classic time to start getting interested in our inside and being able to be quiet and reflect on our experience, both inner and outer. The kicker, unfortunately, is that our personal growth also involves risk, or at least a felt sense of risk. And in a way, then, it becomes not for everybody. Not everyone is willing to take risk. And our tolerance for bearing with risk or anxiety that often comes with it is based a lot on our life experience and who knows, maybe even in the genes. I know that when some people hear me talking about this work around retirement years, they're going to be daunted by it, and they may not be real willing to enter into it. And particularly for those people, I would encourage you that there's not a one-size-fits-all to this approach, but that possibly you can see, what you can tolerate or what does interest you, and buy in according to what you feel your capacity is and your energy level and your life circumstances and so on, and possibly get something valuable out of it. Maybe not as much as someone else who is able to immerse themselves more, but I can't even say that for sure. So in AA, they often talk about, especially when someone is hesitant about AA or says it's not for them or criticizes, they will usually say, take what you can and leave the rest, or words to that effect. So I would say that here too. Take what you can get out of it. If it's not as much as someone else because they've immersed themselves more, that's a difference between the two of you, and you'll still have something worthwhile and will be worth whatever amount of time or energy you're able to put into it. I've mentioned before that even seemingly small changes, small course corrections, so to speak, can have big results as they play out and go along. So sometimes something that didn't seem so big at the beginning, later on we look back and realize it could have been a significant turning point in our lives. We certainly got at that point something that turned out to be valuable to us. So you decide, you do what I call standing in your own authority. Here is what I heard Carmen say. Here's what I think I would be interested in out of that, or the amount of effort I'm able to put in, or anxiety I'm able to tolerate, and I'll go for that part, and that's fine. You call your own shot. I'll throw in a little reminder here too that if something I say in the podcast, or if you read one of my blog posts, you can use the contact form at the bottom of most pages on my website to ask a question, where sometimes you can put a comment in the blog page. And the website is retirementwithmeaning.com. So moving on to the tyranny of chronological age, as I refer to it, what I basically mean by that is not letting your chronological age determine your attitudes or actions, and especially when it comes to the imposing of certain things. And also, of course, other people can use our chronological age against us more or less in reminding us that, you're 65 years old now, or you're 70 and you're going roller skating, or those kinds of comments. I have seen that if we listen too much to people quoting our chronological age as a reason for imposing or suggesting some sort of limit on us, that can lead us to limiting ourselves prematurely and starting a process that winds up being the opposite of growth enhancing and life enhancing, retirement years enhancing. So here's a true story about one of my clients who was in my second half of life group and who I had in other aspects of therapy. She went to her grandson's birthday party, and one of the activities they were doing was roller skating. Well, my client was 60 years old, but she roller skated and was generally active. In the process of this episode, though, she tried a trick or a maneuver she hadn't done for a while, and she hadn't been skating much lately. She lost her balance, began to fall, and as she fell, she reflex action, as most of us would do, stuck out her hand and arm and wound up breaking her wrist. When she went to her doctor, and I'm sure he was looking out for her best interests as a medical man, he told her no more roller skating. I had known this particular client for quite a while, and we had a good relationship. I knew a fair amount about her, and she was a healthy, active woman. To my way of thinking, she didn't fall because she was 60 years of age. She fell because she had tried a trick she hadn't done for a while and lost her balance. And even then, if she had been able to do the unusual thing of not sticking her arm out and taking the fall on something a little more meaty, she probably would have been okay or just come away with bruises. I guess I might have suggested prudence around doing tricks she hadn't done for a while, but I don't think I would have suggested she stop roller skating altogether. Because for one, if she began limiting herself on other physical activities and other kinds of experiences, the loss of those, I think, can wind up being worse than even the broken wrist or bad bruise or whatever that someone could get in the process of whatever activity they were doing. I believe this is an important enough point that I want to illustrate it with a few more live examples. Two of them would involve me. Quite a number of years ago now, I participated in the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. It was an extremely hot day. I had been well prepared and had been careful to hydrate, but actually in some respect that turned against me. But I wound up, after I finished the race, winding up in the medical tent and needing IV fluids and then a trip to the hospital as a precaution. So when the doctor who examined me at the hospital looked at my chart and saw that I was 62 years old, he asked me what I was doing, running a marathon. Well, I gave him the short form answer, and he did begrudgingly, I guess, say, well, at least this was an acute episode. But I could tell that he thought I probably would have been better off, not to be running marathons at that age. But even though my chronological age was 62, I was in a lot better shape than a lot of men considerably younger than I who were not as active. And if I had given up marathoning or at least running, and my cardiovascular fitness lessened, and with it my general health could start heading downward. So to me, the greater danger was in becoming a couch potato rather than continuing to exercise maybe more or a little more vigorously than maybe many people my age might have. And I guess I should throw in a disclaimer here that I'm not attempting to give medical advice, and I wouldn't encourage people to come to me for medical advice. But from my own lived experience and from being a therapist and seeing the impact on people's lives of various aspects of their endeavors during their lives, I wouldn't suggest that someone go out and run a marathon who hadn't run for the last 20 years, but I also wouldn't discourage someone from a vigorous activity when they had worked their way up to it and done it in a safe way and did not have any medical issues because they had checked with their doctor or other healthcare professionals as appropriate. On another occasion, I was having a problem with my left knee, and this was when I was running quite a bit, and I ended up being referred to the doctor who was the orthopedic doctor for the University of Pittsburgh football team. When he examined me and asked me what I wanted, I said, well, I'd like to be able to run again. He said, good, let's work on that then. He had two, I don't know if they were residents or what their role was, but they were doctors in training or doctors in some later phase of their education, and they were following him that day, and he asked them what they thought my diagnosis was, and they immediately said arthritis. I guess they had looked at me, saw my age, knew that I was running, and that was like a no-brainer. And the doctor gently told them he has a torn meniscus. When I got to the rehab facility that the doctor referred me to because he thought they did good work, and I did too, one of the things they had me doing for my knee was what they called wall slides, and I began to call them old people squats. And of course I did what they told me to do. But after I had completed my rehab, I began to think about that. And I thought, I do wall slides instead of regular squats. I'm going to start doing the dumbed down version of this and the dumbed down version of that. and before you know it, I'll be a semi-invalid. And of course, I was probably exaggerating a bit, but my idea was not to start giving up any aspect of my approach to physical fitness based once again mainly on my age. And to this day, as I speak, which must have been 25 or 30 years after that episode with my knee, I still do regular squats and other regular exercises that I've done all my life. And I'm able to without fear of injury. I'm not saying everybody should do that, because some people certainly could make themselves worse or stop exercising altogether. But I thought it was a good idea to give some examples, because it's a very important issue. It's one of the aspects, I believe, of the way that we think about aging and the way that we think about retiring have a dramatic effect on the way we age, the way we retire. And so very worthwhile keeping conscious of and making decisions about these various important aspects of our life, such as exercise, which is extremely important, but also has to be done in a way that's reasonable for the situation. But just because you happen to be 60 years old or 65 or whatever doesn't necessarily mean it's no longer for you. I just caution about making a decision solely on chronological age, because I've seen 20-year-olds who are more like in the shape of a 60-year-old and 60-year-olds who are in shape closer to a 20-year-old. So it has to be weighed person by person, and I would encourage that. And I'll add this, just so you don't think I'm sort of some exercise freak that you have to be careful about. Sometime after the Marine Corps Marathon, I ran the Pittsburgh Marathon, but I promised my wife that time that if I began to feel sick, it was a pretty hot day once again, I would drop out. I would not try to push through to the finish. And I did. There was some issue with the heat, and something I later found out, that my body did not retain salts well. And even the doctor at the Marine Corps Marathon had told me, you can drink all the water you want, but if you don't have salt in your cells, the water's going to wash right out of them. And that's what was happening to me. But anyhow, I began to feel sick around the 10th or 11th mile. And I remembered what I promised my wife, and I did. My daughter was running that one with me, and I walked the remaining distance to the finish line, where I met my daughter, and she finished, and then had some issues that night where we had to take her because of dehydration to the emergency room. And I think she had the same issue as I do. And a doctor friend of hers told her she had never seen such a low salt level in anybody. So I imagine that she too had trouble retaining salts. Well, I've said a lot about this chronological age issue and not limiting ourselves just because of chronological age. And I'm wondering what you're thinking, if you're thinking anything about it, and what your normal view of exercise would be. Perhaps, I think it might have been George Bernard Shaw, or someone like him, who said that he got his exercise by going to the funerals of his exercising friends. So he might be on the other end of the pole from where I am. I won't take the time to ask you to pause and go inside and reflect on what kind of thoughts or reaction you're having, but it might not be a bad thing to do in the very near future when you have a little time, because I think it's an extremely important decision around this issue of chronological age and activity as we get older. Well, the next of my main points for this podcast is closely related, and I think of it in terms of keeping on, whether it's outright exercise per se or just our regular life routines. We're made to be in motion, and certainly we might be in slower motion as we're older, or perhaps not so old but haven't been that active. But one of the biggest examples that I recall, once again from my own life, is my mother-in-law married a widower when they were probably at least in their 60s, maybe even close to 70. And he had polio when he was young, and so he walked with a limp, but he walked. At the time they got married, he mowed the lawn, he did some physical things, working in the yard and so on. But the longer they were married, the less active he became. And eventually, he began to, a wheelchair looked like it was in the near future for him. And at that point, I had taken to picking him up to go to church so that I could help him to the car and into the car and out of the car and into church, and then reverse that process. And I remember telling my wife one Sunday when I came home that every week now I could feel like I was holding more of his weight. Each week he seemed to have gotten a little bit more unable to handle his own weight, to move like in control of himself without that much assistance. And he began having a lot of falls. He was a heavy man, and once he started to fall, he could not control his weight. So he would bang his head off a dresser or land on the floor. And he was going to the emergency room fairly often because of falls. So eventually, and not that long, the doctor had him start using a wheelchair. On the other hand, there was a man at least as old or even older as my wife's stepfather in our area, and he had something go wrong in his brain, an embolism or something, where he was in a coma for a month, and they didn't think he was going to live, and I don't think anybody ever thought he would walk again. But he did live, and he wound up being able to walk with heavy braces on his legs. And he used to walk uphill every day, I would say probably 3/4 of a mile at least from where he lived to the same church where I used to take my wife's stepfather. And he walked that, no crutches or anything, in braces, up the hill and back every day. And long after my wife's stepfather was pretty much totally confined to a wheelchair, he was still walking. And I think the big difference was that he kept on keeping on. He had the motivation not to lose his mobility and not to lose too many things because of losing his mobility. And so some years later, he was still walking uphill to church with his braces when my wife's stepfather was confined pretty much to his wheelchair. So a part of my point, and there is one here, is that it's very important how we begin to see ourselves and think about ourselves. And especially in the area of physical activity and physical fitness, I know I can attest to when we get older, it takes a very long time to get into shape, and we can lose it like overnight. If I get a small injury or get an illness where I can't run, and I miss a couple weeks or something like that, I would notice a big difference, and then it would take me a long time to get back to where I was before I stopped running for those 2 weeks. And I didn't have any serious health-threatening issues or anything. It was just a matter of fitness, which is important. I'm sure some of you who are up around my generation, or maybe the generation before, maybe a little more than that even, recognize the theme for my show as I'm always chasing rainbows. I just like the tune, the melody. The actual words are not that hopeful, I guess, but I like the tune. But despite some aspects of the song, of the words, I'm not that crazy about, I chose it partly because I think it's important to be able to still dream when we're older, and to therefore what I kind of called chasing rainbows, chasing something that it's never going to happen, and it's silly for an old person like me to even be thinking about such things. But my own fear and what I've seen happen to people that I know is if we don't allow any chasing rainbows to happen in our head, and we do everything in a grimly logical way, think about them in a grimly logical way that is an accumulation of 70 or 80 or 90 years of some not so good experiences, we can wind up losing some of our pleasure and kind of a slow drying up of the spirit. Whereas if we can still dream, still chase rainbows, it can help to keep us vital, questing, just not settling into that gloomy view of old age that so many people begin struggling with. In fact, what I've been talking about over the last few minutes is so important that this might be a good time to take stock. My basic thesis is that the solution to our problems in retirement is change in us. And then, since change is going to evoke anxiety due to the sense of risk, means that we're going to have to bear with anxiety, with discomfort, in order to grow. As you'll hear again, there's no growth without risk. So therefore, what I've been talking about gets particularly important, especially when I'm talking about the tyranny of chronological age. I advocated for not allowing chronological age alone to determine what we'll allow ourselves to do or not do. Recall the incident of the woman who broke her wrist while roller skating and the doctor telling her not to roller skate anymore, mainly because she was 60 years old. On the one hand, in our retirement years, we need to work our growing edge in order to deal with our retirement years and change in ways that are good for us. On the other hand, we do need to exercise appropriate prudence. I'm not advocating for being rash or careless or taking imprudent risks that could cause harm to ourselves or to others. Absolutely consult medical and healthcare practitioners or any professional or qualified person whose information can be helpful to us. Then use that information to make life-enhancing decisions one way or another. And throughout all these processes, engage, be aware, make decisions. Don't bail out of life, especially due simply to chronological age. Our culture and even conventional wisdom can easily push us toward the restricted, unhappy life that's predicted for us as we age. Don't let it make you smaller than the way you want to live. Well, as I look at my friendly timer, it appears I am going to have time to get to a little bit more than I thought I was. So let's take a look for a minute. I think the cure for exhaustion will be timely and will fit into the time space I have left. David Steindl-Rast is a Benedictine monk, a speaker, writer, and philosopher. He was asked by a friend who was going through some difficult times to speak to him about exhaustion. He said, quote, "The cure for exhaustion is not just rest, it is wholeheartedness," end quote. And I'll repeat that. The cure for exhaustion is not just rest, it is wholeheartedness. And before I elaborate on what I believe was his meaning, or at least a part of it, I'm going to go back and tell you a true story about a woman who attended one of my talks at a local library. She stood up at the end when I asked people to make any comments they wanted or ask questions, and I had given this quote at that talk. And she said she worked for 20 years, the last 20 years of her working life, at a job that she had no connection with. It did nothing for her. It did not connect with her heart at all. And yet she did it because she didn't feel she could take the risk of going on to another job and having that not go well. Among other things in her life circumstances, I believe she was taking care of an invalid mother or a mother with significant health problems, and she needed security. To make matters worse, a coworker who worked with her for maybe the last 10 years of her working life was very difficult to deal with, very difficult to take, day after day after day. Finally, she was able to retire. And she said not very long into her retirement, she couldn't get over what a difference it made in her state of being in her daily life, in her welfare, not to be in that job any longer. She felt like a different person, like a new person, like a weight had been lifted. But as many of us don't, she had not realized the toll that job was taking on her day by day. And so many of us, it seems, are in jobs or relationships or other venues that hold nothing for us. If anything, they kill our spirit rather than helping it. So I believe one of the things David Steindl Rast is saying is that it's not work, it's not the physical exertion or even the mental exertion that exhausts us. It's doing work that has no meaning for us, that has no heart connection for us, that often is done out of either sheer necessity or out of sheer duty. It's drudgery. It's not alive. The good news is that the second half of life, our retirement years, are a great opportunity to do what has heart for us, to do what has connection, freed from having to go to work X number of hours a week, children usually having been raised, often, hopefully, having at least enough money, if not oodles and oodles of it, for what we need. We have the opportunity to do for ourselves, to do not what we have to do out of duty or responsibility to someone else, and not that those are bad things, but we finally have the opportunity to do what does something for our spirit, for our inner well-being. Now, once again, this can be both the threat and the opportunity. We can be drawn to it, but we can also realize that something different comes with it than from doing our usual drudging work operation. So I guess I'm saying, in a way, that retirement can be the cure for exhaustion. Not because we're not working, going to a job every day, but because what we are doing can have meaning and heart and life and spirit for us. Okay, then, as I begin to draw to a close, I thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me for podcast 4 and possibly take a look on the website, retirementwithmeaning.com, and read the blog posts that are there. They interact with the podcasts and sometimes are a little more detailed or a little less detailed or about a totally different subject from each other. And in this early going, it's good to have both because I'm using the first few podcasts and the first few blog posts to create a frame for the work that's going to follow. And since you can hardly go wrong turning to Carl Jung to talk about old age, I'll close with a quote of his which is very pertinent to what we've been talking about in this podcast. Carl Jung says, quote, "The greatest potential for growth and self-realization exists in the second half of life," end quote.